In the 1960s, 110 babies were born every day at Kandang Kerbau, more than any other maternity hospital in the world. Large families were the standard then. Coming from a family with 10 children, Angeline Tan remembers having to walk to school to save money on bus fares. Her father was a fruit seller, earning $200 to $300 a month, and her mother had to scrimp and save to make ends meet. The family squeezed into one bedroom in a Queenstown flat.
There are about 3 families in the flat and about 17 of us. We have no beds, except for my parents' bed. We don't have like what you have today in the children's bed. We don't even have mattresses. We slept on straw mats, and I remember sleeping under the bed. I think every corner there's somebody, even the balcony there's somebody sleeping. And when I grew older, I remember sleeping under the dining table in the hall. We don't have milk powder. Most of us fed on breast milk. And the older ones will have to look after the younger ones. Yeah. And even the clothes you wear is all those pass-me-downs.
Their problems were shared by many others. Even in 1964, more than 500,000 people were living in slums. There was neither running water nor proper sewage. Contagious diseases spread rapidly in these unhealthy conditions. The HDB had started building better homes for the people, but it had still to catch up with a rapidly growing population. It became increasingly difficult to find a job. With 150,000 people jobless every year, there were still masses of people entering the workforce. Singapore was then in the early years of nationhood. With far more people looking for jobs and decent homes than what was available, the consequences would have been disastrous if population growth did not slow down. The answer? Family planning. Though it had begun on a small scale in 1949 with a voluntary service set up by a group of nurses and doctors' wives, their work reached out to only a few. The Singapore Family Planning and Population Board was formed on the 7th of January 1966. Its initial message was, have only as many children as you can afford, but space them out. Nurses and midwives from the maternal and child health services counseled new mothers and pregnant women on family planning, stressing the importance of the mother's health and spending enough time with a child. At Kandang Kerbau Hospital, mothers were counselled by nurses and doctors, and the Family Planning Board dispensed contraceptives at subsidized rates. It was a good place to work, as 7 out of 10 women in Singapore gave birth here. But there were many social preferences to overcome.
In those days, people had large families. The influence of mothers-in-law was still very great. People thought that having large families, it was a sign of kind of blessing. And then there was, of course, the desire to have as many sons as possible. So we had a great deal of trouble trying to overcome these prejudices. And of course there was ignorance about the methods of family planning, there were fears. And to overcome these really, you need to be very patient and you need to be able to explain simply and clearly, because most of our patients in those early days were not very well educated.
Public campaigns were mounted to reach a wider audience, and the message got through. The total fertility rate, which indicates the average number of children a woman would have, fell from 4.7 in 1965 to 3.1 in 1970. This meant that on average a woman would have about 3 children. Population growth had indeed begun to slow down. Whilst in 1963 only 9.5% of married women practiced contraception, by 1970 the number had increased 6.5 times to 62%. But there was a sudden upswing in births in 1970. One reason was that the post-war baby boomers had now become mothers, and there were others who wanted to have more children. New measures had to be introduced, among them housing incentives for smaller families. Income tax relief was allowed only for the first 3 children. Delivery fees in hospitals were raised. Abortion was liberalized, and sterilization encouraged. In 1972, the catchphrase became, "Stop at 2."
A healthy and happy life with a small family.
Out of this emerged the idea of the two-child family as the norm for Singapore, as more and more accepted the good sense of having only as many children as they could care for properly. By 1975, the fertility rate had fallen to replacement level, which meant that the average number of children had fallen to 2, just enough to replace the parents. In 1975, the board turned its attention to the young.
Teenage is the time for learning and growing. You are young only once. Rushing into marriage, into having your first child, and your second, means rushing into problems. So take your time to say yes. A happy family is worth waiting for.
And women did take the time to say yes. Between 75 and 86, the average marrying age for women rose from 24 to 26, and they had the first child at 27 instead of 24. Family planning had become a way of life. So after 20 years, in 1986, the Family Planning Board closed its doors. Circumstances had changed. Women in Singapore saw a new role for themselves. They were better educated and their focus was shifting from family life to career advancement. Angeline, who works as a systems analyst, had only one child at 29. Though she married 5 years ago, the constraints of education and career kept her and her husband from starting their family until 2 years ago. While smaller families have brought about a better quality of life, they've also created a population problem. Within 20 years, fertility rates have fallen 70% to 1.4 in 1986. This means that parents are not having enough children to replace themselves. If the trend continues, Singapore will face a declining population with less young people supporting the old.
We would be facing labor shortage, we would be facing this shortage in manpower, and at the other end we would be facing an increasing old age dependency ratio. Now, an aging population brought about by declining fertility rates would mean that our society would have to bear an increasing and tremendous burden of social services to be provided for the aged, the most serious of which would be increase in health costs. Then an aging population also meant the productivity of the labor force would decline because, older people obviously could not adapt to changes so easily. So all these combined together would make the economic development of a country slow down quite a bit. The quality of family life would also change, you see. Children growing up in very small families or children growing up as only children would not be able to enjoy the kind of family support, family warmth that could be provided when you have a much larger number of people around the household, when you have a much larger kinship network. And the effect of this would be felt in, say, 10, 15 years' time when the children themselves grow up. Because they would be growing up with fewer siblings, they would be growing up with fewer cousins, and they would have fewer uncles and aunties, you see. And the impact of this on quality of family life as well as on the emotional satisfaction of people as people, again, it would be felt more severely when this generation of young people grow old themselves, you see. They would have less relatives around who would be able to help support them, whether materially or emotionally and psychologically.
Singapore's social and economic conditions today call for a different perspective. To achieve optimal growth, population planning is a must. A population planning unit was formed last year under the Ministry of Health. Its task is to look at population trends and suggest policy changes to the government. For now, the unit wants to see more children for those with greater affordability. Its message, have 3 and more if you can afford it. While the choice of having more children remains an individual one, it's a choice which will determine the future and survival of our nation.